Disconnected, yes. Good morning, everyone. We have a very small group. You know what? We're going to make it worth your while. How's that? Small but mighty group. And hello, everyone on that is connected online. So today, in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the assessment life cycle and thinking about the fairness and accessibility considerations in all of the steps of developing and delivering an assessment. And we're going to be then specifically looking at how those concepts are applied for HiSET, which is the high school equivalency test that PSI develops and manage. So let's start with introductions. I'm Isabelle Gontier. I'm the Chief Assessment Officer at PSI. So in that role, I oversee all aspects of our assessment programs, test development, psychometrics, data analytics, and all of that across all of the businesses that we serve, including HiSET, but also our certification programs and licensure programs, language assessments, and everything. I have the pleasure today of co-presenting with two amazing colleagues, and I'll turn it over to Tanya so she can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Tanya Haug, and I'm the Vice President for the HiSET program.
And I'm Lindy Elwood, the Scoring Manager, Marking Manager for HiSET.
Excellent. Okay. So, as I said, just kind of like working on expectation, I'm going to be spending a bit of time in really talking through the key concepts around the assessment life cycle, all of the key steps. So really setting the stage on best practices, foundations, and all of that. So please, if you have questions along the way, don't hesitate. And we'll try to answer questions as we go, but we'll also make sure that we leave enough time. We'll make sure, because this is also live webinar, we'll make sure that we have the mic here. If you do have questions, just raise your hand. We'll run. There's not a lot of people, should be easy to manage, but we'll run and make sure. And then I'll be monitoring as well online. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in. Okay, so whoops. Yes, this is working. So when we think about the key considerations from an assessment standpoint around fairness, accessibility, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, why does it matter? Well, it matters from a validity standpoint. It matters from a reliability, legal defensibility. You need to consider those fairness and accessibility elements throughout the assessment life cycle in order to be able to defend your tool and ultimately be able to defend the outcomes, the results, the scores. So that's important, and you'll see how it plays into action. So here in this context, what are we talking about? So we're kind of taking a lens of, and I know it's a little tricky because we're like thinking about concepts like diversity, equity, inclusion. And I want to acknowledge that the context right now kind of like makes it a bit challenging in terms of how are we sort of fully encompassing those concepts. Here in this context, what's really important is that it's not about making decisions based on those considerations. It's making sure that all of the considerations related to those elements are captured across the board in developing a fair, valid, and reliable assessment. That's what it's about. And that's why it's so important. When we think about the who, so that's where also making sure you have the right people engaged across the various steps of the assessment life cycle is critical. You need representation of your key stakeholders, the people that are going to be taking the test. And you'll see how important that is in the context of HiSET specifically. The when is also important when you think about when you're developing and delivering an assessment. When do you need to engage the core key stakeholders? And how, and again, there's that D&I concept where, we need to, the way I like to think about it is, again, I'll refer a lot to fairness and accessibility, because in the end, those are the core elements that we need to keep in mind. So when we think about those elements, so just stepping back for a minute here, just to make sure to set the stage around what are we talking about here? When we talk about the assessment lifecycle, what do we mean? It all starts with defining what needs to be assessed. So in the concept of credentialing, we call that like a job analysis process or a competency profiling process. In the context of high school equivalency exams or language assessments, it's defining the core knowledge and core curriculum and elements that needs to be assessed in order to determine what a score on the assessment means. And then in defining what needs to be assessed on the assessment, you need to also define how it will be assessed. And in doing so, you need to make sure that you're taking into consideration all of the core factors and you're engaging in confirming and validating what needs to be assessed and how it needs to be assessed, that you are engaging the right people, a representative set of people that will be able to confirm, yes, that makes sense. Yes, that needs to be assessed. Yes, this is the level we need to think about. And then once you've established that, then you have what we call like the test specifications, the key parameters in terms of defining what the assessment looks like. And then you're leveraging that, you're using that to develop the assessment. From a test development standpoint, there's multiple steps involved in that, in terms of creating the assessment items, reviewing the assessment items, validating them, making sure they meet the requirements. And again, who you engage in that process is critical. There's obviously lots of conversations about leveraging generative AI to help in generating new content. And really, in a way, this is the hardest part of developing an assessment, is to create that first draft of an item. Why not use technology to help us with that? Provided that you have the right parameters, you've set it up with the right material to be used, so on and so forth. But then what's really important is that concept of the human in the loop, where you have people reviewing, validating, vetting. And again, those people need to keep in mind and all of the key concepts in terms of making sure, are there any biases in the content? Is it is the language level appropriate? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's key elements to consider there. Training of the people that are reviewing, whether they're subject matter experts, they're assessment developers, those are critical elements, again, to keep in mind as you go through that development process. Delivering the test. There's many, many, many elements to also consider from a fairness and accessibility standpoint. How is it administered? Where is it administered? How much does it cost to be able to take that test? And are testing accommodations needed? How to request testing accommodations, what's available to whom. All of those are key considerations around fairness and accessibility. And then as you think about, then you're generating scores, you're generating results, you've established a standard required to be successful on the assessment. How do you go about that? Who do you engage with that? And how do you leverage the data, the psychometric data, to help inform the process of updating the content along the way, of learning? Because, sometimes with all of the due diligence of reviewing test questions, there might still be elements that are popping up that, nobody would have seen coming. So being able to perform some types of analyses where you're looking at subgroup analysis, see if different groups are performing differently on certain types of items, and learning from that process to help refine instructions, review processes, and so on and so forth. So all of these elements, as you think about how you establish what needs to be assessed, develop your assessment, validate the assessment, deliver it, review and validate it, and provides results. All of these have very important components that relate to fairness and accessibility. So diving in a little bit more. So when you think about the assessment, when you think about the questions, when you think about the test, I said, who do you need to involve? So think about the population that is being assessed. Who are they? Where do they live? Which areas are they in? So all of those elements are critical. If you think about a credentialing assessment, what areas of specialties are they covering, so on and so forth. So identifying the group that needs to be involved and making sure you have the right level of involvement, engagement, and representation. Then training is critical, making sure that these people know what to do, being able to kind of acknowledge when you review specific items, questions, case scenarios. Sometimes you'll build a scenario, you'll build a narrative, and you're trying to add color to it to add some of the judgment, critical thinking, analyzing a situation. You might not need to put in some of that color. Is it necessary? Is it necessary to identify the age of the person, the gender of the person, so on and so forth? So sometimes it is, depending on the context, it might be, but it's important to be able to review and identify what is needed and what might not be needed. So keeping things objective. And as part of the training for the assessment developers and the subject matter experts, those are critical elements to review and consider, and being able to, through the training, to have a conversation about it, to highlight it and provide visibility and awareness. I think awareness is definitely one of the key concepts. So how does that work? When you think about your exam questions, your test questions, some of the elements you need to keep in mind is the language level, what words are you using, the level of the language there. So I was talking about case scenarios. You describe a situation, you describe people involved in a situation. Keep it objective. Think about terms and positioning that can actually perpetuate stereotypes. Think about that. Try to avoid pronouns instead of, use a title description. Like an example that I like to use that, when you think about a nurse and a doctor, you say like she and he, you're kind of, perpetuating some stereotypes that a nurse is female and doctor is male. So you can actually talk about the nurse, you can talk about the doctor instead of like necessarily having them represented by a specific gender. Make sure that, again, from a language level standpoint, using words that are recognized, that are at adequate level. Also making sure that, not using expressions, regional expressions. Sometimes, again, you want to add some color, you want to add some elements to the scenario, but some expressions could be challenging to understand in other regions and areas. And also thinking about if your assessment is in English, English as a second language is a key consideration. You want to assess, if language is what you're assessing, it's one thing. Of course, there's, based on the assessment you have, sometimes language will be the element of assessment. But if you're assessing math, if you're assessing science, if you're assessing humanities, language is not what you're assessing. It's a component of it, but not what you're assessing. And then be careful in terms of how you're using technical terms. And I always say, sometimes technical terms will be needed. You might need a glossary to help and assist with that. So one element also critical as you look at the development and the process of developing those exam questions or test questions, having a checklist is really important. It's always thinking along the lines of thinking about the situation, the information presented. Is it fair? Is the information accurate? Is it meaningful? Meaning, do you need to include all of those details? Does that add something to the assessment piece? So it's really critical to think along those lines and make sure that as you review the content and you validate the content, use the checklist to kind of make you aware as a final step in the process to ensure you haven't incorporated elements that could generate some concerns and questions from a fairness standpoint later down the road. When we talk about test delivery, so there's many elements or many ways where fairness and accessibility will have an impact on test delivery. So location, people live in the country and cities, different, depending the assessment, if it's domestic, global, there's many considerations in terms of making it accessible. Making it accessible also means modality. If you think of the modality, having it in your assessment in test centers, in schools, in community centers, administered through online proctoring, on paper, where applicable. So again, it's all relative to the programs. There might be some factors that are, some elements that are possible for the program, but all of these elements are critical as you think about what is available for your test taker population and how do you make the assessment accessible to them. We've been talking a lot about remote proctoring versus test center administration. Obviously, depending on the type of assessment, you need to protect the integrity of your program. So you need to make sure you have the right level of security engaged. And then having the choice is also an important element wherever possible, because yes, some people will say online proctoring is great because it's flexible. You do it in your own home. But for some people, they might not have the equipment that they need. They might not have the bandwidth that they need. They might not have a private room that they can use to actually take the assessment. So in that situation, these people, it's easier for them to take the assessment in a controlled test center where they don't not need to worry about equipment, bandwidth, and a secure room. So all of these elements are really critical as you think about key considerations around test delivery. Accommodations, we'll talk about it in the context of HiSET in a few minutes. But what's really important for accommodations is making sure that test takers know, or learners know, what's available to them, that they know and understand how they request accommodations. What information do they need to provide? What's the process to follow? All of those elements are critical, again, from an accessibility standpoint. Fees, sometimes fees could be prohibitive to certain test takers. So in setting the fees or having programs available to allow better access, those are important considerations. So one last element that I wanted to cover here, and I promise I'll try not to bore you with the details because I'm a psychometrician at heart, and when it gets to analyses, I can go crazy, but I won't. But the idea here is that as you have your assessment, you've developed it with the best practice in mind, all of the key elements and considerations around fairness and accessibility across the board, things can still happen. Questions might perform differently than what you expected. So having a process in place to be able to identify the differences in performance that could impact the reliability of your assessment, doing some level of differential analysis, looking at subgroups that are meaningful for the context. So important to mention that it's not about slicing and dicing the data. It's about identifying what meaningful groupings you have to help assist in making decisions of what needs to be included in the final score or not. And as I've mentioned earlier, also identifying opportunities to say, those types of items are not performing well with certain groups. We might need to review and revise the instructions we're giving to the item writers and item reviewers. We might need to review inclusion of some types of items in the assessment. So it's a feedback loop, really, really important to have that. So and then it's important to kind of leverage that data to understand how it could have an impact on certain groups, potentially disadvantage certain groups, and then identifying ways of continue to improve and enhance the assessment based on that data. So with those concepts in mind, now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya so she can review and provide a little bit more information about HiSET, what is HiSET, and then how those concepts then apply in the context of HiSET. There you go.
Thank you, Isabel. Do I have anyone in the room that's not familiar with HiSET? All right. I didn't think so. I thought I would just check. So if you are an adult educator and you are basically an influencer for some of your students, you know that HiSET or high school equivalency is just one step in their journey. They are most likely going off to some sort of school or training, or perhaps directly to a job or maybe a promotion within a job. So a lot of what we try to focus on is making sure that they have been, they're aware of what their options are. And so we use this educational and career pathways graphic to help reinforce that. It's something we obviously hope that our HiSET candidates are aware of, but also for educators to kind of keep in mind, this is one step. This is one step for you, and there's lots of possibilities out there. When we talk about the population that we serve, and that's collectively that we serve, you as adult educators, state staff, and others, what we're looking at is a population, the working age population. So those from 18 to 64, there are 21 million people out there that do not have a high school credential that are of the working age population. I will call it an untapped resource that we have. So we're talking about 1 million that are enrolled currently in adult education classes. There are, in this year that is represented here, this is the 22 to 23 federal year, 80,000 high school equivalency or high school credentials were issued under adult education. It is just a really, really minuscule part of that 21 million. So we have a lot of work to do. When we talk about those that are enrolled in IET programs, 51,000. Again, there's over 1 million without high school diplomas and that are currently unemployed. So that really is a population that we want to make sure that we are providing outreach to, that we're informing, and that way we can get them either into the workforce or into a career pathway through an academic program. Any questions on this? When we look at the youth that are out there, so those that are not currently enrolled in school, there's almost 200,000 from ages 16 to 24 without a high school diploma. They're not enrolled in school and they're unemployed. Such an amazing resource that we are all trying to tap and encourage. So when we're talking about the HiSET exam, we are have been approved in 30 states and US territories for high school equivalency or proficiency credentialing. The credentials, of course, are issued by the state agencies. So they're usually departments of education or labor, workforce, or a community college or technical college. We have 5 subtests, which we'll review. You should be familiar with those: reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. There are minimum scores required for each subtest, and then a minimum cumulative score to pass the HiSET battery, including a minimum score for the essay. And Lindy will talk a little bit more about the essays. And of course, our test is available in English and Spanish. As Isabel mentioned, we have paper-based, computer-based, and then computer-based via remote proctor. Every state has different eligibility requirements. Every state has different rules and policies. So some of these things may or may not be available in your state, but might be available in a state near you. So a little bit more about the HiSET subtests. So we do have these 5 areas. Of course, we have broken down English language arts between reading and writing. There are a lot of benefits for many of the students that are out there for us to have that split, so they can focus on their reading skills or they can focus on their writing skills. The majority of our test is multiple choice, with the exception of the essay, which you must actually pass. In all, it's about 7 hours to take the full battery. For reading, there are 2 separate times for English and Spanish because there are literally more words in the Spanish translation. And so it requires just a little bit more time to read. Any questions on these? Accommodations has been more and more so a hot topic. So there are some typical accommodations: extended time, a separate room, large print, screen magnification if you're taking it on computer, color inversion, calculator, a reader or scribe if you need that in a test center, um, additional break times, which are typically not allowed during a regular test, or even a sign language interpreter for the instructions. Accommodations for us for this population has been a real game changer. So in terms of this population, those in adult education, many of them are undiagnosed for disabilities. And so likely a component of why they perhaps did not finish during traditional K-12 training. And so we find that accommodations is actually a large part of the population that we serve. Now I'm going to hand it over to Lindy to talk a little bit more about the HiSET exam development and scoring.
Thank you. So this is all relating back to how Isabel started the presentation, talking about how we approach HiSET considering fairness. And to start, it's with the test design. And in this case, it's aligned to the college and career readiness standards that were determined to be appropriate for this population for adult education. And with that in mind, we then go to item writing. With this, we recruit our subject matter experts across content areas, grade levels, and locations. And part of this too includes focusing on making sure we don't have a bias within our own item writers, because oftentimes we find teachers tend to focus on their students. This is our population, but really that's just one bubble of the group. And so our training then focuses on the test specifications and how to apply those accurately. And then continuing the cycle, we have multiple rounds of review in which we focus on different parts. It can be content, accuracy, fairness, accessibility. Particularly when we think about AI, this is when we want to make sure we're focusing on fairness and making sure that human component is there, and to continue ensuring that it is accurate and aligning. We have external subject matter experts as well as internal. And before we even put items out there, we have to trial them because we think they look good on our end, but we never know how they will perform within the population. And with that is when our analysis comes in. And you would think that once an item is approved, it's out there, it's good, we're done, but it's actually a cycle. We never stop looking at an item, we never stop reviewing. We're always looking at data before we select it to be used again. And then on the essay scoring side, one misconception we have is that we do not have humans looking at the essays, but in reality, we do have humans scoring our essays. And these are content and language experts in both Spanish and English. When we're recruiting, we do look for those that have this background. And in particular for Spanish, they do have some sort of certification proving their proficiency with it. And to prove that it's additionally, they have to go through a process within the interview. They're doing sample scoring and writing and demonstrating their own proficiencies in both languages. And then after that, they have to do even more. We have our own training program for them. And after completing that, they have to pass our own sets, proving that they know how to apply our scoring criteria correctly. In terms of the actual SE scoring, they don't see any test taker information. And again, this helps prevent the bias when looking at it. They see the prompt that they have and then the actual response, and it's just based on that alone. We also have 2 humans looking and rating. So again, continuing that fairness, making sure everyone's applying it correctly. And if they disagree, a 3rd person will come in and score it to make sure that we are doing it accurately. As the scoring manager as well, I will go in and back read. So their scoring leader, I will go in and check them. So there's always a check. Again, we never are just satisfied with one level of completing something. And then as they're working, the reliability continues. There are embedded validity responses that have a set score, and these are blind to our markers. So it's one way for us to monitor and make sure that they are applying the criteria correctly. As I said, back reading we go in to do, and then quarterly we also have our reliability analysis that our psychometrician does and looks at how they've been performing and scoring. Any questions on any of that? Yes. Oh, we'll get you the mic. Thank you.
And so I was kind of paying attention and doing some work. So you might have addressed this, but we were talking about yesterday that HiSET does have like real persons scoring. Is it just for the essay, right? Or is it for the whole thing, for the whole essay, or for the whole?
Essay is
test.
human scored, but since it is multiple choice, we can scan it. But if there's a challenge, it will be checked by a human.
Thank you.
Yes, it seems we all have that distrust of machines still, so we understand.
Well, we have a certain level of checks still, even with the machine that is in place, so we can verify accuracy. So, yeah.
Well, no other questions will be at our booth as well. Please come visit. We're happy to chat all things HiSET and answer any questions you might have about something unrelated to this. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you.